Hello and welcome to the podcast where we're exploring game economies, game design, and the way that we create balance inside of games. And I'm delighted to be joined by Daniel from CCP. Daniel, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
I'm Daniel Ramotowski. I'm a senior game designer for EVE Online at CCP Games. I've been at CCP for 10 years now, and I've been playing EVE for 20.
20. Oh my, don't tell me that. It reminds me because I was on the original beta and I spent so long mining. I must admit, I did run out of endurance with the mining, but I've got friends who run corporations and stuff like that. Obviously, EVE is a phenomenon in itself, and I'm sure we'll get to that. But I want to talk a bit more generically about kind of your way of looking at kind of game design in particular. What is a game economy to you? For me, I'm not just interested in the commercial side of games, although I'm very interested in the commercial side of games. But for me, the economy is all about the ebb and flow, risk reward, resourcing, and all of the components that go into a game. But I don't want to kind of scoot the pooch. I want you to kind of tell me what you think. What is an economy for you in a game?
So besides the things you mentioned, which could be described in one word as progression, essentially.
Yeah.
Economy to me is a way for players to interact with each other. Like that's my perspective on the economy in games, especially like asynchronous interaction, right? Because synchronous interaction, usually think about combat and things like that. But when you think about asynchronous interaction, then economy is that thing to me.
I love that. I genuinely think that's, in fact, of all of the people I've talked to on the subject, that is one point that's really hammered home to me just now. When you break down the exchange mechanism, because it's basically an exchange is a form of communication.
Yes.
And we might be doing an exchange in terms of an action in the game. We might be doing an exchange in terms of my interaction with another person playing the game. And so I think for me, that really gets to the nub of the heart, and also why understanding the psychology of human behavior is so, for me, such a heartstone of what makes a good game work. Is there's a resonance between the player, the game, and the other player. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. It is like we make the games the way so that players get rewarded for their activities, right? We create challenges for them to overcome, and then we reward them. So then they have a reason to go through those challenges and to solve the puzzle and to compete with others mainly. And some of the rewards they get are not necessarily useful to them, right? But might be useful to others. If we are thinking in that way, then we create economy right off the bat without even introducing any market system, anything, any form of exchange. Players will try to find a form of exchange themselves if they end up having something that is more valuable to someone else than for them. And I think that's the foundation of how the economies work. First, you need that. And only then you supply them with tools to actually facilitate the exchange.
And I think that's particularly interesting because I think it feeds into other aspects of game design. I mean, you've got the core kind of experience and the thing I need to do now. You've got the progression aspects of it. I call that the context loop. And again, the mechanisms that we use in gameplay to do that deferred engagement. But actually that kind of sense that there's also a kind of an element of value proposition that is specific to me and my state in the game. And it might be down to life stage. It might be down to what I'm after out of the game. But at the end of the day, the different value propositions versus my effort I've done, what I've collected. I'm rambling now, but you kind of got me a bit excited because I kind of really like this way of looking at exchange and then looking in particular at what value is. With that in mind, are there sort of techniques or kind of understandings that you've gained over the years that help you better understand what it is that a player values at its essence?
That's a very difficult question, but a smart one.
Shucks.
Yeah, what the player values. I don't think there's an objective answer to this without looking at types of players and in context of the games they are playing. Like we can try to find some truism, for example, right? The value fun, or they value the gratification or whatever that is. But I don't think that's helpful or practical. I think more practical would be talking about, like, I can talk about EVE for days.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Please. I mean, I don't want to put you off. I just don't want you to feel like you have to.
Yeah. So just following the thought I had before about rewarding players with things that they may value less than someone else, and thus incentivizing them to do an exchange. So the amount of ISK, which is EVE's currency, in-game currency, for some players, that defines their progression, right?
Yeah.
Just seeing the number goes up. That is what the progression is for them. And whatever they do, they value this the most, as in if they acquire some equipment and they see that they can exchange it in a way that will make the number go up, then they will do it no matter how good the equipment might be for them otherwise. But that's one group of players, right? Other players might think about it completely different perspective. Like they value things they have built themselves. So they probably will not rely on trying to find a ship they want on the market. Mm-hmm. And they don't want to engage in exchange with others. They want to build the ship from zero, from scratch themselves. And this applies to other games too, where you yourself might be able to find particular item or acquire it from others. And this is also part of the economy, right? The human behavior or psychology, where players value things they worked for directly more than the things they worked for indirectly by getting money from one point and spending it to acquire the item they need. So those are just two aspects, just two of many aspects that this can be looked at from.
Well, I think there's also aspects, there's the direct value proposition that we're getting from the action. There's the indirect value we're getting from that interaction. And by that, I mean, if you're something like a currency, you describe very effectively, when your currency score goes up, your leaderboard effectively has gone up because you now have more cash than other people. But then there's more sophisticated ways of looking at it. For some people, the currency is the way that I can get the largest ship, as you described. I want that particular ship. And then the aesthetic choices have become more important as the value proposition than necessarily the exchange metric. And so essentially, you're gaining the currency not with the purpose of increasing the score, but with the purpose of exchanging that. So it's a secondary kind of behavior almost. Understanding this pathway of value proposition. I mean, my instinct is there's a maturity level that goes with this. And I don't mean this in like a human being maturity necessarily. I mean, when players start a game in a more early stage, they're discovering the game, they're learning about how the game fits into their lifestyle. Often, I think we find a default to these more basic metrics. But I think as they understand the game in more depth, as they understand how to optimize the game more effectively, then some of these secondary value propositions, I think, become much more important to them. Does that resonate with what you think?
Yep, absolutely. By maturing in the sense that you described, it is player getting more mature as in understanding the game better and seeing more opportunities where they can evaluate the value proposition from one's hand and the other. At the beginning, they can't, right? They are unable to. That's one aspect of it. But just going back to what I said about different personalities, maybe it can be the same person that exercises different types of personalities depending on how mature they are in the game, but also this maturity aspect can be tied to progression. Like, for example, in many games at the start, you are not very worried about how much money you have, but you are rather worried whether I have a basic axe to cut a tree, right? And if I get it, I won't be selling it to get a better weapon. I better stay with that axe that I have. So like the basic needs. We, like at CCP, among the designers, even developed, you probably know, the Maslow's pyramid of needs.
I very much do.
Yeah. So we have that for EVE as well.
Yeah.
Like, how does it look for an EVE player? What kind of needs hierarchy there is? So first they need a ship. Then they probably need enough money to replace that ship if they lose it. Then they need the feeling of security, which is provided, but enough money. And then, only then, they can start venturing into aspirational goals. Like, I want bigger ship, I want more shiny ship, or whatever you call it.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. And I think these evolutionary things, I think it's interesting though as well that I think you do see these happen in cycles. And I think at some point you always want some hook, some parameter that we hold to show me what good looks like. And it feels to me like, again, it depends on the game. Because I try to look at games generically. I'm trying to avoid going into specifics because There are people who are better at that than me. But I think that you do see these patterns where you start with something simple as your metric. You then learn how to use that metric to optimize your later experience. But you're still, in your optimization, you'll still have something you hang on to as a way of saying what I am. And that could be prestige, it could be level, it could be any number of things. But I think we kind of shuffle our way through a good game, a long-term game experience by trying to find the next thing. For example, the size of my corporation, the number of people in my team, the scale of my guild, the firepower that we can muster. Those kinds of things, I think, make a difference, but they play with different parts of the psychology, I think.
Yep, that's true. And that ties to the maturity that you talked about.
But I think, this is, again, we're going to go into Eve, I'm sure, but it's hard to look at, the something like Eve because of the brave, unique, scary, crazy mindset you guys have of having a real economy operating. And that means that general principles of supply, demand, elasticity of demand, all of these kind of core fundamental economics principles live inside Eve as real. So you can't just sit there and mine asteroids forever and suddenly get to the top of the charts. You've got to have some more nuanced engagement with the game to continue kind of going through. How does that actually work? I mean, do you have an advantage if you have a degree in economics playing Eve? I mean, I'm just throwing it out there.
I mean, one of the most successful traders in Eve, for example, he has his own Twitch stream and talks about economy in Eve extensively. Like in his daily job, he's an economical analyst, for example. Yeah. So it does help, yes. And people like I myself, I started as a trader in Eve. I was trading because in my real life, I was a trader before.
Yeah.
So I just took that experience and applied it to the game, and it worked. And that was amazing. That's what hooked up me to the game. So yeah, when you have economy as complex as Eve, it helps if you can look at it from analytical perspective, if you can see like high level patterns, and if you can recognize them. And the sooner you spot them, the more advantage you have. So other like practical things that have evolved in economical terms, like economies of scale, for example. This is very applicable to if you want to be a manufacturer, for example, where you build ships and want to sell them to others. The scale matters a lot because it is much more efficient if you focus on small group of items that you produce and you produce them in large amounts. Then you can easily outcompete other people who produce them in smaller amounts. So those, like, if you are familiar with these concepts, then you can have advantage in the game. Or another one, like vertical integration of production. Right?
Yes, absolutely.
Because you if you are familiar with this concept, then you apply it to Eve, and suddenly you realize that you are avoiding paying taxes on every level of production because you don't have to buy and sell the goods. You have them from the start, just in a different form, which you reshape in various cycles of the production. So knowing those things definitely help in economy that aspires to be very close to real one.
Well, that kind of immediately makes me think about. I'm a bit of I did economics as an A-level. I did very badly, but I was very fascinated by Keynesian economics and the cycles and flows in particular. And so, do you see things like, the people differentiating in what they produce and getting benefits from that kind of differentiation versus commodity approaches, or maybe even things like, if I invest in certain areas, do we see things like accelerator principles taking effect where you see better growth because of that kind of that tactical intervention? Do we see those kind of fundamental principles of economics writ large?
So I'm not very familiar with the fundamental principles that you just described. I'm not an economist myself.
Fair enough.
Maybe an amateur.
Hey, I'm not very good.
But we do see things like that happening, where one way of talking about it would be how players, for example, how the economy reacts to things that happen in the game. So, for example, there's a big war that has been announced. Immediately, the day that happens, someone is buying out all the ships of the specific class because they know that one of the alliances involved will be using those ships in the war. Or there was a big battle and thousands of ships were lost. Then you can see the effect of that on the market right away. But also from the other side, players can affect economy on purpose to their advantage through manipulation. Players do try to manipulate the market, and this is allowed. We are fine with it. This is economy, and if you can do it,
it's the whole concept in some ways, isn't it? I mean, obviously, we talked about this before, but I mean, you can't talk about E without talking about the sort of the huge losses that happen, when these wars happen, when fraud in-game, not cheating. This is the trouble. It is the language we would normally use in the real world would be cheating, but it's in context with the game. It's fair and valid behavior, arguably.
The words we are rather using is scamming, for example, right? Like if you exploit someone's ignorance, that's scamming, and that is allowed. For example, and if you control
essential part of the simulation.
Yes, simulation of society, because that's what EVE's economy is. It's just one phase of the simulation of society.
But in order to achieve an economy like that has the potential to be able to sustain such principles of economics with such a huge audience, with so much resourcing and so many currency points in there, it must be incredibly difficult to work out how to ensure that you have the right scale of scarcity for certain objects, the right effort required to be able to essentially reward that effort with said currency, said resources, the right production process to sink the captured resources or the acquired resources into functional production, and then to have enough of that destroyed through wars, etc. How on earth does any human being manage to think on the scale of that?
So that's one of the fundamental aspects of EVE, what you just mentioned, that the resources are lost forever, right? Like every time a ship is destroyed, then almost everything that was used to build it or to compose it, it's gone. So those are the resource sinks, the destruction. And the creation comes from like mining asteroids, which those are resource sinks. So the economy there, it can be difficult to manage it. Like we are currently at that moment, at least that's what players say, and we kind of agree with that. We started a process. So let's say if we go back a few years, like 5-6 years, the economy was okay, but then we introduced one specific ship called a Rorqual that allowed for mining on an unprecedented scale. So that one ship suddenly became the most desirable ship in the game for most of the entrepreneurs, let's say. So a lot of those ships appeared in the game and they started mining like crazy. And we even have a period in the history of EVE that we call the Rorqual era, because in that period a lot of minerals were brought up into the market and into the stockpiles, and it wasn't very healthy in the end. So we started making some changes, and then we started which we called the scarcity period, and we called it officially towards the players that we need to do something because economy isn't going in the right direction. Maybe it's not very unhealthy yet, but it's going in the wrong direction.
Starting to overheat.
Yeah. So we started doing changes like 4 years ago, I think, and they were met with various level of excitement, let's say.
Yes, I can imagine. And also I imagine that there are people who aren't often able to separate their personal desire for their game state versus what's better for the game as a whole.
Yep, exactly. And we shouldn't expect that from players. It's like
it's not their job.
Exactly, it's not their job, but also like it is us, the game makers, who are responsible for this. Players collectively are responsible too, but not individually.
Yeah.
And we shouldn't expect that from them. And that is all fine. So we have, for example, maybe just another topic for a second, Council of Stellar Management. So this is democratically elected council from among the players, where other players vote for their representatives. And we have that council that comes to Iceland every year for a week.
Yeah.
And we also are working with them throughout the year. So they sit for 1 year and then they can be re-elected or not, depending on how this goes. But they also advise us on how we should do things, right? They have tremendous knowledge about what's going on in the game, especially at the high level. When you think about the size of the organizations that exist in the game. Like we know on the individual level how the economy works. We know how it works for small groups, and we also know how it works from statistical perspective in big groups. But if you have someone who is in control of a group or has an influence over a group of 40,000 players, because that's how big their organization is, then they can give you perspective that you cannot have, that you cannot acquire otherwise. So we use the feedback from those players too to manage this economy, to like get it back on the right track. And as I said, this process was for about 4 years now. We kind of chilled a bit with it because it went too far maybe in some aspects. But to just answer your question, it's pretty difficult to manage it. It's like because of the unpredictability of the crowds and individuals as well. It's just very difficult. So we have to monitor. We have our own internal economic council where we meet every week and discuss these things and look at charts. And it's just so strange that this is a video game. But
but this is why I think Eve's such a phenomenal concept, because you're essentially running it almost like a nation in some ways. It's like you've got the same fundamentals. You've got to, you've got to look at, resourcing and scarcity. You've got to look at the price of things. So interest rates essentially may not be quite the right thing here, but there is still about the value of an exchange. And now, in fact, in many ways, I think maybe this is the sort of thing I find so interesting is, something like Eve, where how does pricing actually work? Well, when it's a real economy and players are exchanging between them, you at least, unlike a lot of games, you at least have some mechanism inbuilt to the extent that they will offer you more or less for those resources to a certain extent. But is that true? And does pricing become like it's supposed to in the real economy, quote unquote, Adam Smith, whatever? Is that dynamic nature of the economy actually provide an equilibrium by default, or is it more likely to provide stress points? Does that make sense?
I think I understand the question, and it does provide equilibrium, 100%. The difference between EVE economy and real economy is that in EVE you don't have to eat and you don't need a house.
Yes.
So there's like different dynamic when it comes to spending and needs that you need to cover, right? The baseline is at very different place than in real life when it comes to how much income you can have and how much you actually need to survive, going back to the Maslow's pyramid. But yes, the price is what definitely is the equilibrium point between supply and demand. And the supply is based off of the people's will to engage with particular content that produces the certain items that then they are exchanged, or like how much effort it requires. So that's supply, and demand is of course how powerful that item is or how useful it is for specific types of activities. And considering that we have thousands of various items or tens of thousands and hundreds of various activities that produce those items or consume them, then you have those microeconomies for every item type, right? And like a funny thing that I can share, I was working in balancing like combat modules a few years back in EVE. And when I was balancing them, one of the attributes that I looked at for each module in particular group was its market price, which is 100% dictated by players, right? Like I imagine that in a single player game, you work the other way around. You decide the stats of the particular module, and then you decide how much it should cost comparing to other similar modules. In EVE, I took like different approach, like how much this module costs and why, right? And because I know this price reflects supply, which is how much of this item can be acquired in a period of time with X effort, versus how much it is demanded, and in comparison to all the other items that are similar. And I remember a conversation with a person who was the economy director on EVE at that time, and he was also surprised by this, that this can be useful in our game. Probably in any other game, you wouldn't look at it that much.
I think it actually is a really useful way to look at it generally. I mean, what's in my mind, though, is that it's very easy to assume there's just a connection between damage per second and price, whereas I think it's way more interesting than that. When we're looking at kind of like ammo supply, we're looking at, storage capacity, reload rates, we're talking about range, we're talking about rate of fire. So I did some work back in the day very, very low level. The game wasn't successful, but it was really interesting exercise to think about how you would classify different weapons in order to be able to have variables that would be interesting. And I think, I kind of wish I'd come at the money part of it, because I think money is a really useful lens. It's a very clean one that we get instinctively. I used tiers at the time as my proxy for money.
Okay.
Well, it was blockchain in this particular example. So I had a rule, which is you would only have X number of each weapon type per tier. There could only ever be X of tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. I think it's like 500 for tier 1, 100 for tier 2, and 60 for tier 3, or something like that. You can have different skins, but anyway, who cares about my stupid ideas? But the point was, this idea of being able to reframe the question about what should weapon balance like really made it much more interesting, because I had a value, essentially. I called it tier, you have actual price. But that then framed the other parameters. What made this different from that? And that takes me on another sort of question. So one of my favorite interview questions that a friend of mine mentioned, he has this idea where he gets people to give him different variations on a health potion. And how many different variations of a health potion when the only variables you have are time and hit points. And it's fascinating. And he doesn't hire anyone who doesn't come up with at least 10. Which I think is fascinating. The whole point of that, the reason for mentioning that, is that what you're describing is how do you make the weapon systems interesting and appealing? Well, people are going to hand over in-game currency and in some cases real money currency for those things. I need to then define them in ways that justify that value proposition. And, you can't hide behind money, in that context, in-game or real money. It's a thing. It's something we have worked for, we engaged with. Anyway, so I find that whole process intensely interesting. One of the things in my mind, though, is it's the payoffs, it's the compromises that make those interesting in my mind. When you were looking at that price point, were you looking about compromise of weapon A versus weapon B?
Yes, definitely. I mean, weapons in EVE have several attributes each or more. So what we've been talking about earlier essentially means price can be used as a common denominator, right? Yeah. Allowing to compare the actual value between two different things that have different attributes and different parameters and different classes of attributes. So compromises, as in this item has attribute A higher than the other item, but attribute B lower than the other item. So then it is applicable in different scenarios, right? So again, looking at a price may help you out figuring how often it is used, because that drives the demand then. Was that your question?
Yeah, pretty much so. The other sort of aspects of that are the wider compromises. For example, I have only a certain number of hard points on my ship. I'm going to be taking my ship into certain conditions. Do I specialize my ship with a certain type of weapon lineup, or do I want to be as flexible as possible? And the fact is, if I'm going to choose the flexible weapons, they're not likely to be as effective on the specific, target that I would if I was doing a specialist weapon, loadout. The other part of my mind is that so capacity, I think, is a really important, interesting thing. The power required to set up the systems, all of these provide these wider compromises that I think make the texture of the choices I make, and the economy then is impacted by those choices. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And in EVE, it is raised to a level higher because of the fact that you are risking the equipment that you are taking with you, right? Yeah. So there's a saying among EVE players, your ships are your ammo. Like, consider them as such. If you acquire a new ship, you will lose it. Just be okay with that.
You will lose it.
Yeah, you will lose it as soon as you undock. And people do factor in the cost of their equipment and in the risk they are taking while they're going on trying to make more money. So they take that into the equation. Like, if I do particular content and I know that I can lose a ship every 10 days, I need to calculate how much content I can get, considering that I will pay for the lost ship to replace it, so that I am still in the positive. So this is another aspect that they have to consider here.
Yeah, and I think, again, that just, because it's, again, EVE is this unique case, but I think a lot of the lessons from EVE can be absorbed in a wider range of games. The wider range of games for me are things like, even when I'm looking at just basic principles of the fact that the point where whatever my exchange rate in the game is, whether it's the cosmetics I'm going to wear or whether it's the loadout I'm going to take in, it's going to have an impact not just on me but on other people I'm playing with. And knowing the extreme end, we've got, I think Eve is good to say is the extreme end, whether you've got a literal laissez-faire environment, shows just how far you can take it. But knowing that within that there are levers that already exist, like the value proposition of the weapons that I'm going to go in, the fact that my ship, when it's destroyed, is destroyed, that resources are going in. These are, I think, really fundamental principles that any designer can benefit from.
Totally. Yes. It just gives a good framework to think about these things, even
but
if you
would
don't
you
use
recommend more games took this hands-off? It's not hands-off, I know, but, I can't think of a better phrase than saying hands-off, because you're not. So let's face it, a lot of games that it's not an open economy. There is a price list. There is an action list. There's typically, you look at a lot of seasonal content. There's a finite number of challenges generally. There are a finite number of things you can then use the results of those challenges, and there's a finite amount that's been offered for that season. Yes, you can go and do other things in the game, but essentially it's pretty locked up. Whereas for Eve, it's not locked up at all.
Yeah. The exchange between players is the biggest factor here. It depends on whether your game has that or not. You think about economy for your game completely differently if there's one actor versus hundreds or thousands or maybe even several that play or compete or collaborate with each other.
Well, I'm always taken to Skyrim for these things because that's kind of my jam. But it always occurred to me how much more interesting the game would have been. Okay, it's single player, but the Elder Scrolls kind of world. If the Elder Scrolls world was more open economy, what would have happened? I would have probably spent a lot more time with the crafting. I'd have spent a lot more time, honing my armory skills. But then the issue with that, and I think it's the same issue that happens with a single player game, is you get to a point where it no longer matters. You've earned too much. You've earned more than you would ever need to be able to utilize. Do you think there are lessons in Eve where other designers can take that sort of would prevent these kind of overruns essentially in economy design?
So there's two ideas that I have in my head right now. And one is meaning behind the money, right? Like, what does it mean to you to earn more and more? And like as you say, at some point you are so comfortable with increasing the number that you don't care about it anymore because it's so easy and it almost goes up by itself. If there hasn't been any other meaning behind the number than its value going up, then it will lose the appeal. If you provide the meaning to a player to actually utilize more and more and more money and greater scales, then that probably can be still appealing to keep earning the money. That's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it would be making it harder and harder over time. Depending on how good you are with it, right? How good the player is with it, making it more challenging to expand their wealth, so to speak. But those both things feel like artificial, and probably for a reason, because they are in single player economy. They are artificial, right? Yeah, they will always feel like that. But I'm just suggesting that there might be still ways to do something about it. In other games where we have multiple players, then engaging other players is always the end goal, and maybe not a goal, but end solution, I would say, because they provide the meaning for the money. Like, if you can make it so that one player can utilize their wealth to either compete with others or to help them out, then no matter how much you can earn, you can always use it in a meaningful way, and you will keep having this incentive to earn more if there's a reward for spending it. Let's say.
I think there's also a third way, which is to add elements where there's more. So for the same resources you're creating, there are more sinks, especially where you can add meaning to those sinks. And to a certain extent, you're just describing those one of the other sinks that you can have as other players, essentially. And so it is kind of the same thing you're saying. Having the ability to, again, I think it's in some ways it's a simple equation. I put effort in. I get rewards. Where am I putting the rewards that makes that meaningful?
Yeah. like some games, what they do, for example, like simulation games, like city builders, how they fight with this problem is they have the random events, right? Like floods or whatever, some catastrophe that will make you feel good about being prepared for it because you hoarded so much resources, be that money or any other resource. And it works okay in those games, as an example, where like getting more and accumulating wealth is rewarded in that way because you are prepared. I lost the train of thoughts.
No, but like you say, city builders are dealing with this by having externalities that have an impact on the process. And I mentioned the word externalities because it's a phrase used by economists to basically wave away, problems and ignore reality, which is probably a bit mean for me to say as not an economist. But I think this whole idea, though, of understanding the flow matters, understanding when it's narratively relevant for us to be able to leverage something in the game. And I think in particular, finding ways to, you can have a war, you have wars, but they're not externalities in Eve. Those catastrophes are essential aspects of the tension inside the game. And it's where I imagine it's often where you've got, like in the real world, you've got conflict over access to scarce resources quite often. Knowing that is naturally part of the process for me makes something like Eve really interesting. But again, why I think it's such an interesting thing to think about. Look at how Eve is dealing with it. Yes, there is this natural conflict, but conflict there is, and conflict leads to a sink. And that sink, the meaning behind it, I think is really relevant to the whole process of understanding your game. As we were thinking that through, another question came to my mind, which was one of the issues we have in the real world economy, you could argue, is generational wealth. So the idea that established wealth prevents new users, new entrants from being able to participate to the same length or same depth as other parties who've already got generational wealth. Have you seen something like that take effect yet in
So there is some of that. So we have corporations in Eve, which is the primary structure for groups of players, like guilds in other games. So corporations themselves can accumulate wealth. And in that sense, maybe it's not generational, right?
No.
Because it is rather an established group that can have their members replaced over time. But that group can accumulate wealth and then can use it in a good way, as in to prop up the new members faster to get into competency in various areas. And those groups tend to grow and be healthy. And actually, those are the most beneficial groups that we have in the game that care about others and use that wealth accumulated by previous generations of players and current ones as well to their benefit.
And actually, that was the kind of underlying part of where I was going with that particular question, because I've observed this, where I've seen the generosity of these organizations, corporates, in helping new users getting up to speed. But to me, the reason why that's so effective is partly, yes, it's human, great, fantastic, lovely, but it's also providing the only real resource, arguably, in the game, namely a player is actually the thing that's doing something. So in some ways, I would argue that the corporations are acquiring actual production resource in the sense of recruiting a player. I mean, that's a fairly cynical way of describing it, but I mean it in the best way. I mean, does that make sense to you, though?
That is perfectly accurate way to describe it. And players who think about this in high level, they understand this perfectly, and that they do it very intentionally. I mean, people that don't really analyze it well, they do it intuitively, try to recruit players to make their group bigger. But players who think about it analytically, they do it on purpose and in a calculated way. Like, if our organization is to survive and outcompete others, we need to grow. We need to keep replacing the players that are gone. Because players don't have to play Eve. People stop playing Eve. And we have to keep replacing them. So the recruitment programs is a thing that exists in every major organization in the game, where they have a team of recruiters that can be 50 people just trying to recruit new players into their organization and then help them out using that wealth that they accumulated. before.
And I think that's an interesting factor because it shows that there are social dynamics that are underlying the economic dynamics, which I think is what centers Eve as such a culturally significant experience. It is, I think, possibly one of the most interesting simulations out there because I think it is actually simulating a cultural experience, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, yes. And
yeah, I can't think of another example that does it at that scale.
As far as I know, there's none, and I've been looking.
Yeah, I bet you have. But with that in mind, I think you mentioned this to me before, but are there people looking at Eve as a research vector for wider impact on the world?
Yes. Definitely. I mean, there's like multiple anecdotes about it, but some also like concrete facts. Starting with anecdotes, like the moment the number of players in Eve became bigger than the number of Icelanders living in Iceland, that was an interesting moment where like Icelandic Ministry of Economy started thinking about like, well, maybe you guys can tell us something about economies of that scale because it's very similar scale to what our nation is. And there was a collaboration in that sense. I don't know the details of it, but I know it happened. And otherwise, we've been cooperating with universities where they wanted to study the economy of Eve. Economy one is one thing, and it's not only universities. Like some people wrote like their papers for university graduation about Eve economy. So economy is one aspect, but also we studied with other institutions, studied something that we called like Eve effect, for example, where like how playing Eve impacts real lives of players, how they are gaining skills, how they are gaining friends by playing the game. So there's plenty of extensive studies done on Eve or by CCP in collaboration with others, because it is a phenomenon. We recognize it. We created something extraordinary. I don't know how much of that was on purpose and how much of that is by mistake. It's just gone now, but it definitely is a phenomenon, and people want to study it, and serious people want to study it, and it's just a pleasure for us to work with these people.
And I think it's fantastic. For me, what I find fascinating about Eve is, it's a great game. I mean, there's no question about that. But the fact that it has pushed boundaries of what expectations of how games should function is also massively important. But I think there are very few games out there, and there are others, but there are very few games out there which can say that it's having an impact on us trying to understand what humans do. And I think that is a phenomenal place to be. But it does, to me, show something fundamental about game mechanics, that human beings play, and we play partly to learn and partly to connect with others. And so something like Eve is a fantastic example of that. But I think there are lots of lessons that we take from lots of different games about how we react psychologically, how we react to narrative, how we react to, optimization techniques. You mentioned about real world skills and the ability to think about spreadsheets, not just Eve. Eve is very good for people who want to think about spreadsheets. I know this, but also, so are football management games.
Mm-hmm.
My nephew he does podcasts on Soccer Manager. There are folks like there who spent a lot of time enjoying and exploring a game and ended up with a skill set that can be leveraged elsewhere, even down to first-person shooters and the hand-eye coordination that comes out of that. And so, I mean, let's say you were building a new game from scratch. I mean, I know you do build a bunch of other game experiences as well, but if you are somebody out there trying to look at making games and you're thinking about a game economy and you're thinking about what to do with it, what are the sort of lessons you think somebody should take from experiences like Eve to apply to different games?
Like the primary lesson I would like to share with others, especially like if they are after making a multiplayer game, is if you make the game easy, then the connections between people won't be very meaningful. I mean, they might be occasional, they might be funny, and due to that, they might be meaningful, but you won't be able to purposefully create deeper relationships between players or having a game that does that for you. On the other hand, and the Eve example is, if it's hard, is very harsh, and that kind of by accident made it so that players have to collaborate with each other and are eager to collaborate with each other. They're eager to help like majority of players in Eve declared themselves as helpers. So we created this helpscape of reality, a virtual reality, and that in turn created friendships, which is a paradox, but it's really how it works. So my suggestion would be like, you can take one of or the other route, or try to balance in something in the middle, because what we have in Eve is not ideal. It's very good for the longevity of the game and for like long-term engagement and like deep engagement with the game. But at the same time, it causes a lot of new players to just bounce off the game because it's too hard, too punishing, too unforgiving, and they have trouble with that. We are trying to work on it and improve that aspect of the first steps, for first months in Eve for a few years now, and it's going all right. But still, the very nature of the game of being unforgiving, and as I like to quote, the first sentence in the Eve game design document was, "Death is serious matter," and we still stick to it. That can turn many players off. You have to keep that in mind. So you need to kind of find the balance between those two aspects, especially in a multiplayer game. How serious you want this to be, meaning how deep the relationship can develop, versus how accessible we want it to be at the cost of the depth of the potential relationships that can be created. So this is things people have to figure on their own.
I think it's so important. I mean, one of the things that I think is really challenging is, like you say, the retention, especially early on, especially if we don't already have an audience, versus that impact of your action. And I think that's always a tension, regardless of it. Even in cozy games, I would argue, without an impact of your action at some level, you're still not going to have that sense of connection. That doesn't mean it has to always be in your face, smash things up. It just means that there needs to be an obvious connection between the effort I put in and the result I return. And, I actually argue that, even like the Farmvilles of this world had something, but because it wasn't in the harvesting mechanic itself, it was in making my farm look good. And, we don't always have to have the obvious vector of that challenge, but we always have to have meaning. And I think one of the things that separates a designer from a player is an acceptance of that need for that challenge. How do we make it hard and yet still compelling? I think that's a natural thing for a lot of players. They'll often tell you need to do this, when actually all that would do is make their life easier at that point in the game, but they would just churn because there'd be no point in carrying on.
That's the difficulty in choosing or directing the player at the beginning, because the game should reward effort, right? But more precisely, it should reward well-placed effort, not just aimless effort. But every new player is very aimless, so it's just a matter of guiding them towards being correct in picking the right effort and spending their time on it, or allowing them to discover the game, which has its own appeal. But there's a distinction between various audiences. There's some players that like that appeal of not being directed, but rather being an explorer or discoverer of features, while other players just like being guided and getting rewarded for it, at least being recognized for it, for what they are doing.
Well, and I'm not currently covering first-time user experience in the book, but it's a whole topic in itself. And I think particularly the last couple of years post-COVID, that a lot of the rules have changed in what it takes to create a kind of enough communication, an illustration of foreshadowing, but still making that compelling. It's very easy to make it a blocker because I don't want to press another X. The number of games that I've had to just press X for 20 minutes. I literally, no joke, Final Fantasy 14, I think I pressed the original Final Fantasy 14, you pressed X like for 30 minutes before you actually did anything meaningful.
Yeah,
it didn't work for me. I know people love the game and I think they've improved that game since, but no, not for me. Anyway, Daniel, thank you so much for that. So, if there's one thing you want people to take away, obviously we talked about from a economy point of view, but overall, for the whole of the conversation we've had today, and any lessons from Eve in particular, what's the one thing you think a economy designer should think about first and foremost?
Who is the target audience for the game? Because that will change your perspective of what they value the most. If you establish who is the audience, what their priorities are, then that should drive your economy design.
I honestly, I couldn't put it better myself. It's almost like you've just said what I've written.
That's
Daniel,
nice to hear.
that was fantastic. Thank you so much. If people wanted to find out more about what you do and where you are, is there a good way for them to do that?
I'm not very active in the social media sphere. I mean, you can find me on Twitter probably, but I'm really not very active.
It's all good. It's all good. But Daniel, it's been fantastic, and I very much enjoyed our conversation today and also previously. Fantastic insights, and obviously, what an amazing game to be working on. Daniel, thank you so much. And for the rest of you, if you enjoyed this, please like, subscribe, share, doing all the usual other stuff. Hopefully, what you've got from this, I think, is something quintessential about